On Sun Air Flight 227 from Dallas to New York, a modestly dressed black man named Malcolm Reeves stepped on board with a first-class ticket seat. He smiled politely at the flight attendant, but the look she gave him back was filled with suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" A question as light as a breeze, yet cold enough to freeze the air around him. If it were you, how would you react when someone looks at you not with respect, but with doubt, when your ticket is completely valid, yet their eyes seem to be asking, "Do you really deserve to be here?" Just a few minutes later, Malcolm was asked to leave his seat so they could re-verify his ticket. Every other passenger, white, comfortable, untouched, remained seated, unquestioned, and in just 20 minutes, the man they doubted would become the very reason this plane couldn't take off. This isn't just a story about a first-class seat. It's a story about dignity, intelligence, and true power. Before we dive into this unexpected journey, don't forget to hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any story that stirs your soul about justice and human self-worth. That morning, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport was packed. Sunlight streamed through the thick glass walls, reflecting on the polished tile floor like streaks of molten silver. Malcolm Reeves, a black man in his early 40s, walked quietly through the security checkpoint, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Nothing about him stood out: light blue shirt, gray slacks, slightly scuffed black shoes. But the way he walked, steady calm, felt like someone who'd grown used to passing through judgmental eyes without saying a word. In his hand, the words were printed clearly on his ticket: first class, seat 2A, flight Sun Air, 227, Dallas to New York. He glanced at it once more, not because he doubted it, but as a small ritual to reassure himself. No matter how many times he flew, every time he stepped into first class, he still felt like he was walking into a place people didn't believe he belonged. When Malcolm entered the cabin, a white woman in her mid-30s stood at the front of the aisle. Rachel, the lead flight attendant, flashed a quick smile, but her eyes told a different story. Her gaze flicked over the ticket, paused on Malcolm's face, then dropped to his simple clothing. Her lips pressed together slightly. "Good morning, sir. Are you sure you're in the right section?" Her voice was soft, polite, but underneath it was a thin layer of doubt she couldn't quite hide. Malcolm smiled, held out his ticket. "Yes, ma'am. 2A. Rachel took it, scanned the QR code. The screen lit up. Valid, first class. She nodded, but didn't hand it back right away. Her eyes went to Malcolm again, then back to the ticket. "Let me double-check something. Please." She turned toward the small service counter and typed the ticket number in again. Malcolm stood still, his smile unchanged, but his hand tightened around the handle of his briefcase. He knew this feeling too well, the feeling of being double-checked, just because his skin color didn't match the seat he paid for. Behind him, other passengers began boarding. An older white man in a gray suit glanced at Malcolm and slightly raised his eyebrows. The woman with him forced a thin smile, then looked away. They sat in seats 2B and 2C. No one questioned them. Rachel came back, handed the ticket to Malcolm. "All good, sir. Enjoy your flight." She said the right words, but her smile had faded. As Malcolm sat down in 2A, she looked back just for a second. He buckled his seatbelt, looked out the window, and whispered to himself, "It's just a flight, Malcolm. Just another flight." But inside, something small and sharp remained. A quiet bruise left by being doubted for simply sitting where he earned the right to be. The first-class cabin was calm, filled with the faint scent of coffee and expensive perfume. Malcolm opened his laptop and began drafting notes for a meeting in New York. He was a busy man, he always was. But sometimes, between business trips. He wondered, does success really free you from those looks? Rachel walked past again, her eyes flicking toward him almost out of habit. She said nothing, but in her mind floated questions. She didn't fully realize she was asking. What does he do for a living? How did he afford that seat? Did he switch with someone? A small part of Malcolm wanted to say, I'm the one who pays the salaries of people like you. But he didn't, because he knew real strength isn't in snapping back. It's in staying calm when others don't believe you belong. Farther back, in seat 5D, a man named Marcus noticed everything. He leaned toward the passenger beside him and whispered, "This again." "Huh." The other guy shrugged. Probably just a mix-up. Malcolm didn't hear them, but he could feel the tension in the air thin as a wire, stretched tight. No one spoke loudly. But some things don't need words. Suspicion has a scent cold, invisible, and sharp. The plane was nearly full. Passengers settled into their seats. Rachel scanned the passenger list one last time, but when her eyes reached the name Malcolm Reeves, she paused. She looked up at him, frowned slightly, and muttered under her breath, "Strange. He doesn't look like a first-class passenger." Not everyone heard it, but the words, small as they were, fell heavy, like a stone, into still water. In seat 3A, an older black woman watched quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. She'd been asked that same question before. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" And it had never stopped stinging. Malcolm closed his laptop and looked around. He saw quick glances, faces pretending not to care. And still, he smiled. He knew that in this space, one small mistake could turn him from a passenger into a problem. A voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Sun Air Flight 227 to New York." Rachel walked down the aisle for one final check. When she reached seat 2A, she stopped, glanced at Malcolm. He looked up, gave a small, steady smile. "Everything all right, Miss?" The simple question made Rachel hesitate. Her lips parted. Then she replied, "Yes, of course." Malcolm nodded softly and turned back to the window. Outside, the runway shimmered under the morning sun. He took a deep breath. In that light, his face was clear calm, intelligent, but carrying a quiet exhaustion. Not the kind from work, but from having to prove his dignity over and over again. Sun Air Flight 227 hadn't even taken off yet, but an invisible collision had already begun. Not between two people, but between prejudice and dignity. And in just a moment, when the world inside first class shifts, everyone will realize this. Some people should never be judged by how they look, because sometimes the very person you doubt is the one holding the fate of the entire flight in their hands. The atmosphere in first class slowly settled, not peaceful, but quiet in a way that made people more aware of each other's presence. Outside, the low hum of the engines pulsed steadily, like the slow breathing of a metallic giant waiting to take flight. Malcolm Reeves sat still in seat 2A, staring out the small round window where the pale morning light faded across the runway. Everything seemed to be over, but suspicion once planted doesn't disappear just because someone smiles politely. At the back of the first-class cabin, Rachel Porter, the lead flight attendant of Sun Air 227, walked over to where Captain David Larson was reviewing flight documents. She still had the passenger manifest in her hand. "Captain," she said softly, but with meaning, "there's something a little off." David looked up, his face calm and disciplined, the face of a man with 20 years of flying behind him. "What is it?" "Rachel, it's a passenger in 2A. Malcolm Reeves. He's booked in first class, but I checked his ticket twice. The code is valid, but something feels wrong. He just doesn't look like a first-class passenger." David raised an eyebrow and set the papers down. "What do you mean, doesn't look like one?" Rachel hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You know what I mean, Captain. He's dressed very plainly. No carry-on luggage, no expensive watch, no presence of someone who usually sits up front. I just want to make sure there wasn't a mistake." David leaned back, folded his arms. "You checked his ticket twice? It scanned as valid both times. Then what's the problem?" Rachel looked uncertain. "It's just a feeling." David was quiet for a few seconds, then gave a small nod. "All right, I'll review the booking records. Security's been tight lately. We can't always trust a barcode. It sounded reasonable, but it opened a thin, dangerous space between caution and prejudice." Back in the cabin, Malcolm sat quietly, unaware his name was now being discussed behind the cockpit door. He only sensed something unusual the way Rachel's eyes lingered on him each time she passed by, like she was searching for proof of a suspicion she couldn't yet justify. He exhaled softly. At his age, he was no stranger to looks like that. They didn't make him angry anymore, but they carried weight, like memories in his chest, the times mall security followed him around, the dirty looks when he walked into luxury hotels. And now, even with a first-class ticket in his hand, he was being treated like an anomaly. In seat 5D, Marcus Hill watched closely. He'd seen Rachel check Malcolm's ticket again while every other passenger, all of them white, only had to scan theirs once before being welcomed aboard. Marcus sighed, pulled out his phone, and hit record. Not because he wanted drama, but because he knew this kind of story was not rare. And if something happened, at least there would be proof. In the cockpit, Captain David scrolled through the digital passenger list. Everything matched perfectly. But when he saw the name Malcolm Reeves, he called out, "Rachel, you said he's in seat 2A. Right. Yes, that's right. Send me his e-ticket number." Rachel quickly typed on the small onboard computer and transmitted the booking details. David checked the screen and nodded slowly. "No issues, but I'll keep an eye on him. Who books first class without any carry-on?" "Exactly," Rachel replied, relieved to have an ally. Neither of them realized what had already happened in just a few minutes. They had built a silent story together, a story not based on facts, but on a feeling he's not like the others. Malcolm was still unaware. He typed slowly and steadily on his laptop, finishing an email. When Rachel walked by again, he looked up and smiled politely. "Do you need anything else?" The question was so calm, so courteous, it caught Rachel off guard. "No, I'm just checking the passenger list. Mr. Reeves." For the third time, he asked not harshly, but with eyes that saw deeper. Rachel's cheeks flushed. "I just want to make sure everything is in order." Malcolm nodded gently. "I understand. Being careful is good. But sometimes, when you only keep checking one person, others might think it's no longer about caution." There was no anger in his voice. It was a reminder, quiet, but sharp enough to make Rachel stand still for a moment before walking away. In the back, Marcus smiled slightly. He didn't hear every word, but Rachel's expression said enough someone had just touched a part of her she'd never examined before. In the cockpit, a message appeared on Captain David's screen from Ground Operations Passenger 2A. "No issues. Ticket valid. Paid through Sun Air Holdings corporate account." The name flashed by so quickly he didn't notice the two most important words Sun Air Holdings, the parent company of the very airline he was flying for, in first class. Malcolm leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He wasn't angry, not even upset, just tired. Tired in a way that success, money, or titles couldn't fix. He once told his daughter, "You can't make someone see your worth if they choose to see your skin first." But today, even he found it hard to hold on to that belief. The cabin doors closed. Rachel returned to her position, something uneasy flickering in her eyes. She didn't know why, but she felt this wouldn't just end with a ticket check. Malcolm opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of the aircraft. From the speakers came Captain David's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be taking off in just a few minutes." Malcolm gave a faint smile. A few minutes, he thought. Just a few more, and everything will change. No one heard that thought, but it was the first step into the next chapter. A chapter where suspicion goes too far, where intelligence confronts prejudice, and the man they doubted begins to take control. The first-class cabin of Sun Air 227 felt almost suffocating. No one spoke aloud, yet everyone sensed that something was brewing, like a distant storm on the horizon. Malcolm Reeves sat at seat 2A, gently flipping through an aviation magazine, maintaining a calm exterior. Yet inside, he could feel the furtive glances directed at him, not curious eyes, but suspicion, familiar enough that he didn't need to guess its meaning. The cockpit door opened. Rachel Porter hurried toward 2A, followed by Captain David Larson, his face stern. His blue eyes rested on Malcolm, not openly hostile, yet cold and impersonal, like someone issuing a command without explanation. "Mr. Reeves," David said calmly, "we need you to move from your seat for a few minutes. There's a small irregularity in your ticket. We just need to verify it." Malcolm set down the magazine and looked at him steadily. His voice soft, but clear enough for the rows ahead to hear an irregularity in my ticket. "Could you specify?" Captain David hesitated, then replied, "It's a verification issue, possibly a system error, but it's best if you temporarily vacate your seat." Malcolm paused, calm and measured. "I understand. But if it's a system error, you can check electronically without me leaving. I am not causing trouble. I have not violated regulations, and I believe forcing me out without legal cause violates FAA rules." Silence fell. The engines droned on, but no one heard them. Rachel looked down, and David tightened his grip on his cap. "I'm only ensuring flight security, Mr. Reeves," David said. Malcolm tilted his head. Serene, but piercing. "Security does not come from merely doing things right. It comes from treating people right. I presented a valid ticket. Ms." Porter scanned it twice. "I am in the seat I purchased. If there's a fault, it lies with the system, not me. I will not leave without just cause." Nearby passengers began murmuring. A middle-aged man in 3B whispered, "He's right." A woman beside him muttered, "But look, they don't do this to anyone else." Marcus Hill in 5D, already filming, captured the exchange. He didn't speak, but his eyes reflected the truth. This wasn't just one passenger's issue. Rachel's heart pounded. She wanted to follow protocol report to the captain, have the passenger comply, yet a deeper, quieter part of her felt ashamed. She recalled her first impression of Malcolm suspicious. Now, seeing him calm and composed under pressure, she realized she had been wrong. "Captain," she whispered, "perhaps it's not necessary." David cut her off. "Rachel, this is procedural. I'll take responsibility." Malcolm leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on him. "If you believe I'm a threat, call airport security. But I will not rise just because someone feels I am unusual. Feelings are not evidence. A soft clap broke the tension. An elderly passenger in 4A smiled. Well said. Others nodded, while some hesitated, unsure whom to support. David inhaled slowly, attempting composure, yet his control had slipped. Every rational argument seemed meaningless before Malcolm's calm logic. He whispered to Rachel, "Contact the ground. I want verification immediately." Rachel nodded, eyes lingering on Malcolm, the man she had once thought didn't belong. Malcolm sat, hands folded. He understood he was being tested, not just by those in front of him, but by himself. Between anger and reason, between resistance and steadfastness, he remained composed. He recalled his father's words, "You don't need to shout to be heard. Just speak the truth with a calmness others lack." Now, he understood that truth more than ever. Outside, the sunlight shifted to a harsh midday gold. Inside, everything seemed frozen. Rachel whispered into the radio. David waited, and Malcolm doing nothing was the one making everything pause. The tension was not from raised voices, but from silence. A silence that even those used to commanding now respected. Minutes later, ground control confirmed. No irregularities, ticket valid, credentials verified. Rachel relayed this to David. David glanced at Malcolm. His expression stiffened, then said, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Everything is verified." Malcolm nodded silently. When David turned, Malcolm offered a slight smile, a quiet reminder that true control belonged to him, not the authority attempting to impose itself. First class fell silent again, but this time, not with suspicion. It was awareness. Rachel, in her heart, felt a mix of shame and admiration. She didn't know who Malcolm truly was, but she sensed he was no ordinary passenger. She turned away, but the image of this man, sitting still and facing authority with unwavering calm, would stay with her forever. The flight had not yet taken off, but in seat 2A, another battle had been quietly decided, a battle between prejudice and dignity. And this time, prejudice had lost even before it began. The door of the first-class cabin closed with a soft click. Outside, the ground crew stepped away, but inside Sun Air Flight 227, the air was still thick, as if everyone was holding their breath. After Captain David Larson received confirmation that Malcolm Reeves's ticket was fully valid, he said nothing more. He just gave a brief nod and walked away. But silence sometimes echoes louder than any apology. Malcolm stayed in his seat. He didn't need to say another word. Everyone who had witnessed what happened, the looks, the tone of voice, the repeated ticket checks, understood exactly what had just taken place. Yet instead of easing, the tension in the cabin began to split quietly, like two currents of water flowing against each other in the same river. The first person to speak was a middle-aged white man in seat 3C. He leaned toward the passenger next to him and muttered softly, but loud enough for others to hear. "He's being a bit too sensitive, isn't he? If everything's fine, why didn't he just stand up and get it over with?" A young woman in seat 4A turned around, irritation flashing in her eyes. "That's not fair. They didn't ask anyone else to get up, only him." The man shrugged. "I just think if he didn't do anything wrong, why make it a big deal?" Malcolm heard it all. He didn't say a word, but inside he felt that familiar weight, the way suspicion always finds a place to hide among the crowd, like wind behind a curtain. You can't see it, but you can feel it. Near the cabin door, Rachel Porter stood silently, her heart beat loud in her chest. She knew those words were wrong, but didn't know how to respond. For the first time in her career, she felt herself standing between two worlds on one side, colleagues defending procedure, on the other, a man she now knew had been insulted not by words, but by doubt. In row 5D, Marcus Hill lowered his phone for a moment and whispered, "This is how it always starts, not with shouting, but with the silence of people who know better but stay quiet." An elderly woman nearby sighed. "I've flown for over 40 years. I've never seen anything like this. Shame on this airline." But a young man immediately replied, "Don't you think it's suspicious? No luggage, not dressed like first class. Maybe they were just doing their job." The old woman fixed him with a sharp stare. "Son, doing your job isn't always the same as doing the right thing. You'll understand that when you're older." The cabin slipped into scattered whispers, stolen glances, quiet arguments. No one was thinking about the destination anymore. Instead, they were caught in an invisible debate. Was the black man in two-way a victim or a threat? Malcolm felt it. He sat still, hands clasped, eyes staring ahead. He knew that if he got angry, just one person saying he's being disruptive would be enough to end everything. He knew that at this moment, calmness was his only power. He didn't need to defend himself. The truth would speak if he gave it time. From the cockpit window, Captain David glanced out and saw Malcolm still sitting there calm, composed. A discomfort crept through him, not guilt, but unease. He had always believed he was fair, that his decisions came from reason, not bias. But the sight of Malcolm not resisting, not shouting, just being made him feel smaller. Rachel walked up to Malcolm and quietly said, "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry if this caused you any discomfort. I know you did nothing wrong." Malcolm turned to her, his voice soft as a breath. "It's all right, Miss Porter. Sometimes we don't need to change the whole world. We just need to admit when it's wrong. That's where it begins." She lowered her head and stepped away silently. A woman in 4A watched and whispered to Marcus, "Did you see that they treated him like he didn't belong, and he still spoke so calmly?" "I don't think I could do that." Marcus nodded. "That's what people fear most. Someone who doesn't have to raise his voice for the truth to be heard." The cabin slowly split into two clear sides, one filled with quiet shame, the other clinging to the safety of suspicion. Like light and shadow on the same mirror, one reflecting truth, the other hiding behind fear. From the cockpit, David's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We'll be taking off in a few minutes." But no one was thinking about takeoff anymore. Everyone was facing their own question. Have I ever been Rachel or David? Or the man in 3C thinking I was right? While standing on the wrong side, Malcolm looked around, and this time he met a few eyes no longer filled with doubt, but recognition. He gave a small nod, then turned back to the window. Outside, sunlight flooded the runway, a cold, steady light, as if reminding everyone, no matter how subtle the darkness, it cannot hide forever. And inside that first-class cabin, everyone felt it, even if no one said it out loud. This flight would no longer be just another trip. And in just a few minutes, when Marcus's phone streamed this moment to the outside world, what happened in this small space would touch millions, not because it was loud, but because of one simple truth. Sometimes, the division within a crowd is the mirror that reflects a society's conscience. The first-class cabin of Sun Air 227 had fallen into a strange, heavy quiet. No one was talking. No one was flipping through magazines. No seatbelts clicked into place. All that remained was silence layered over the low, steady hum of the engines, like the tense heartbeat of the airplane itself. From seat 2A, Malcolm Reeves sat upright, his hands gently resting on his lap. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. His eyes were fixed on the front of the cabin toward the cockpit door. Captain David Larson had just stepped out, his face set like a man prepared to handle a situation. Rachel Porter stood beside him, visibly anxious. She didn't want this to go any further, yet she no longer had the power to stop it. Every eye in first class was watching the same scene unfold. The captain in his uniform, authority and power in every line of his posture, facing a black man in a simple shirt and worn leather shoes. Two opposites, yet somehow perfectly balanced in this moment. David stopped in front of Malcolm. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the cabin with absolute clarity. "Reeves, I've asked you to leave your seat so we can verify your ticket, and I expect your cooperation. If you refuse, I'll have to call airport security to come on board." Malcolm looked up at him. His tone was calm, like he was speaking in a boardroom, not in the middle of building tension. "Captain Larson, I understand your responsibility, but I also understand my rights. According to FAA regulations, a passenger can only be removed from an aircraft if they are disruptive, intoxicated, or pose a threat to the safety of the flight." He paused for a moment, then continued, slow, clear, deliberate. "I'm not intoxicated. I'm not being disruptive. And I'm not threatening anyone. So may I ask what legal reason requires me to leave my seat?" A ripple moved through the cabin, quiet murmurs, exchanged glances. Some people nodded. Others stayed silent, ashamed to admit they felt the same. David's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected Malcolm to know the law this well. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, choosing his words carefully. That brief silence between an order and a calm refusal made the entire cabin hold its breath. Rachel stepped forward, trying to soften things. "Captain, maybe it's just a misunderstanding. We've already verified the ticket," and David cut her off. "Rachel, this is a security matter. I can't let feelings interfere." Malcolm gave a faint smile, one that carried something like sadness. "You call it security," he said quietly. "But have you ever considered that sometimes people use the word security to cover up their own insecurity?" The word struck through the captain's composure like a quiet arrow. A few passengers glanced at each other, some even nodded. From seat 5D, still recording, Marcus Hill whispered to the person beside him, "He's not just defending himself. He's teaching them something." David inhaled slowly. The authority he was used to, the kind that made people obey without question, suddenly felt fragile, because the man in front of him wasn't shouting, wasn't causing a scene. He was simply using reason, and it was hard to argue with reason spoken so calmly. "Mr. Reeves," David said, "I'm responsible for the safety of every passenger on this flight, and if I feel something is off, I have the right to investigate." Malcolm answered without hesitation. No anger, no sarcasm, just quiet precision. "And I have the right to ask for the basis of that investigation. Feeling something is off is not in the FAA guidelines. That's emotion, not evidence." The whispers rose again. An older man in seat 3B called out, "Captain, he's right. We all heard it earlier, his ticket scanned as valid." A middle-aged woman added softly, "And he hasn't done anything. He's just sitting there." Those small voices of support made David pause. He looked around and realized that the silent power he held was being chipped away, not by rebellion, but by truth. Malcolm remained seated, calm, composed. like a man waiting for a contract to be signed. "If you still want to call security," he said gently, "I won't stop you. But when they arrive, they'll ask why I was removed. And if your answer is, because he looked different from everyone else, then the person being escorted off this plane may not be me." Rachel held her breath. Marcus lowered his phone slightly, eyes shining. The cabin fell into a new kind of silence. Not fear, but awareness. David stared at Malcolm for a few moments. He didn't reply. Instead, he turned, walked back toward the cockpit, each step slow, heavy as though even his polished shoes disapproved of his stubbornness. When the cockpit door closed behind him, Malcolm exhaled softly. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't proud. He was just tired. Tired of having to stay calm in situations that should never exist in the first place. Rachel approached and said quietly, "Thank you for not losing your temper. You had every right to." Malcolm looked at her, offering a gentle, weary smile. "Miss Porter, when you're used to being doubted, you learn to control your anger. Because if you get angry, the world remembers the anger, not the reason behind it." Her throat tightened. She had no words. At the back of the cabin, Marcus replayed the footage. The pale blue glow of his phone lit up his face. "People need to see this," he whispered, not to shame anyone, but so they understand what really happens when prejudice puts on a uniform and calls itself authority. The plane was still on the runway, unmoving. No one spoke, but everyone knew this was no longer just a misunderstanding on a flight. It had become a living lesson about dignity and truth. Two things no title or rank could silence. And in just minutes, when Marcus would hit "Go Live," this story would travel further than any airplane could ever fly. Outside the window, the Texas sunlight was beginning to fade, sliding across the airplane's wing in pale, broken streaks. But inside the first-class cabin of Sun Air Flight 227, the air was warming by the minute, not from heat, but from the silence expanding between every pair of eyes. Captain David Larson had returned to the cockpit. Rachel Porter stood near the back of the cabin, hands clasped tightly, silent, and Malcolm Reeves, still seated in 2A, remained motionless as if he were the only still point in a storm no one else could see. The passengers were divided. Some admired his calm. Others whispered that he was making a big deal out of nothing. But all of the murmurs fell away when Marcus Hill, the man in seat 5D, slowly lifted his phone. "The world needs to see this," he whispered to no one in particular. The screen lit up. A small red icon appeared, "Live." And at that exact moment, the outside world, the strangers scrolling through their phones while waiting for dinner, the silent observers in living rooms far away, began to witness what was happening inside this airplane. At first, only a few dozen tuned in. But Marcus's voice, steady, sincere, made people pause mid-scroll. "This is Sun Air Flight 227 from Dallas to New York. A black man was asked to leave his first-class seat even though his ticket is valid. They said there was a discrepancy, but they can't say what it is." He lowered the camera slightly, showing Malcolm still, composed, eyes lowered to his hands. He's not yelling. He's not resisting. He's just sitting there as if his calm is the loudest protest of all. Within 2 minutes, the viewer count jumped from hundreds to thousands. Comments began pouring in. "Again, it's 2025. Why is this still happening? Someone tag a civil rights lawyer. Now. I know that name Malcolm Reeves is the CEO of a major company, isn't he? Keep filming. Marcus. The whole country needs to see this. Inside the cabin. No one knew it yet, but Marcus's live stream had already escaped the confines of the plane. It had become a mirror held up to an entire system. Rachel stepped toward Marcus, her voice low. "You shouldn't be recording. This is a private space." Marcus looked at her, calm but firm. "There's nothing private about injustice." The words made her pause. For a brief moment, Rachel saw herself through the camera, not as a crew member doing her job, but as a witness to something she knew was wrong. Malcolm looked up at Marcus. His eyes said thank you, though he spoke no words. The comments kept flowing, some from New York, some from California, some from retired pilots, former flight attendants, even people who had lived through similar situations. Each message was a drop forming a quiet storm of outrage and awakening. One comment read, "I'm a former FAA employee. What they did violates policy. You cannot remove a passenger without a safety-related cause." Another said, "I'm a mother of a black son. Watching this breaks my heart. Dear God, will my child have to go through this too?" Inside the plane, no one knew what was happening outside. They only saw Marcus holding his phone and felt somewhere in the air that silence was no longer just silence. It had become evidence. A young white man in 3C frowned. "Are you live streaming this? Why blow it out of proportion? Someone could lose their job over a misunderstanding." Marcus turned to him, voice steady, eyes unwavering. "Sometimes misunderstanding is just the word people use to silence the truth." The man said nothing more. Malcolm heard all of it. He didn't want anyone to defend him, but he knew some things only change when people stop looking away. He thought of his mother, the woman who was once forced off a bus for sitting in the wrong seat, and he knew he could not bow his head. But instead of anger, he chose silence, letting the world judge the injustice for itself. A flight attendant whispered to Rachel, "Have you seen social media? They're talking about us about the airline. The video is everywhere." Rachel froze. She looked around. Everything was still, but somewhere beyond the cabin walls, a wave was rising. A new kind of power no longer in the hands of the captain or the airline, but in the hands of those watching through their screens. In the cockpit, Captain Larson received a message from Ground Operations Captain. "We have a situation. A passenger is live streaming. It's going viral. Thousands are watching." He turned to Rachel. "Troubled. Tell him to stop filming. Right now." But when Rachel looked at Marcus and saw dozens of eyes in the cabin watching too, she shook her head. "It can't be stopped anymore. Captain." Outside, the sun was sinking toward the west. Its last light landed on Malcolm's face, calm, resolute, as though he already knew what was coming. Marcus lowered his phone just a little, voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Reeves, thousands of people are standing with you." Malcolm looked at him and smiled softly. "No, Marcus, they're not standing with me. They're standing with themselves, the part of them that's tired of being silent." The cabin went quiet, but this time it wasn't fear. It was awakening. Within 10 minutes, Marcus's video had passed 1 million views. Local news outlets began sharing it. Civil rights lawyers tagged Sun Air Airlines in their posts. Hashtags like Troika Seat 2A and For Fly with Dignity started trending. The story had left the plane. It had become a symbol, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't need a courtroom. Sometimes it only needs a phone, a witness, and a man who refuses to leave his seat. And in just a few more minutes, as keyboards clattered across the country, the world would have to choose a side stand with silence or stand with the truth. as the first comments started pouring into Marcus Hill's live stream. The first-class cabin of Sun Air Flight 227 still didn't fully realize that millions of eyes were now watching them. But even without an official announcement, something in the air had shifted. If earlier the silence felt like a thick fog, now that fog was beginning to thin, people started looking at one another, at Malcolm, at Rachel, and then, quietly, at themselves. A voice broke the silence. It came from seat 4A, an older woman, clear and steady, yet warm. "I'm sorry, but I've been watching this from the very beginning. This man hasn't done anything wrong." No one replied at first, but her voice was like a pebble dropped into a still lake. A few seconds later, another voice followed. "She's right. I saw everything too. He was just sitting there. They're the ones who made it into a problem." Marcus slowly turned his phone toward the woman, capturing her words, broadcasting them out to thousands of viewers. Rachel, standing near the cabin door, froze. She hadn't expected a passenger to speak out loud what she herself had been too afraid to say. From the cockpit, Captain David Larson heard the murmurs and stepped out again, his expression stern. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. This is a commercial flight, not a place for debate." But that only made the tension thicker. A silver-haired man in seat 3C, the same one who had seemed indifferent earlier, suddenly stood up. "We just want to know why he's being treated like this. If we don't get a clear answer, I'm not flying." His voice wasn't loud, but it struck like a bell. Then, a young woman in seat 2B spoke up, her voice trembling. "If he's forced to leave, I'll leave too. I'm not staying on a flight where people are treated like this." A wave moved through the cabin. A few hesitant claps, then more. Louder. Marcus's camera panned across the faces that, moments ago, held doubt or silence now alive with a quiet bravery. Malcolm Reeves stayed seated. He didn't smile or speak. He looked around with warm, gentle eyes, almost as if to say it's enough. "I don't need more." But what was happening now wasn't about him anymore. It had already grown beyond one man. Rachel stepped closer and spoke softly to the captain. "We should stop this. People are angry, and there are millions watching outside." David froze. He didn't look at her. His reply was flat. "Are you letting social media control you now?" Rachel drew a breath, her voice low but firm. "No, Captain. I'm letting my conscience control me." The entire cabin seemed to stop breathing. A few people turned toward Rachel, and then applause followed. Marcus aimed the camera at her, the flight attendant who had stepped outside the safety of silence. Through the small cockpit window, David looked at the passengers. Their eyes were no longer submissive. They were awake. Malcolm turned to Rachel and said quietly, "Thank you. But remember, I don't want people to think this is a battle about skin color. It's about how we treat each other when we're the ones in power." Rachel nodded gently, her eyes glistening. Marcus glanced at the fast-scrolling comments on his screen. "We're watching from Chicago. Don't let them kick him off. Seat 2A is the definition of grace under pressure. I'm crying. This isn't just a flight. This is a lesson in humanity." Another young passenger, who had been silent until now, spoke. "I don't care who he is, but he deserves respect. If they force him off, I'm leaving too." These words weren't just reactions. They were the beginnings of solidarity, of collective justice, something often silenced in the name of following protocol. David stepped forward again, but his authority, the one that once commanded silence, sounded softer now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I understand your concerns, but please believe we're only following procedure." An older man stood slowly, his voice raspy but strong. "No, Captain. You're doing what's easy, not what's right." Applause broke out again, louder, clearer. Malcolm lowered his head slightly and exhaled. He felt warmth in his chest, not from victory, but from witnessing people find their courage again. Courage to say what's right, even in a cramped airplane aisle. He stood, looked around, and spoke gently. "Thank you, everyone. But please, sit down. I don't want anyone to get in trouble because of me." A woman nearby replied, "It's not for you, Mr. Reeves. It's for us. We've stayed silent for too long." Malcolm smiled faintly. Maybe this, he thought, was the moment worth waiting for. Not that they defended him, but that they woke up. From the back. Marcus kept recording. His voice cracked with emotion. "You're witnessing what happens when one person chooses calm over anger, and when a crowd chooses courage over silence." The cabin, once heavy and suffocating, was now charged with something else entirely, the quiet power of justice awakening. Outside, the golden light of sunset spilled through the window, laying softly across Malcolm's face. He gazed out at the runway and whispered, "Maybe things are starting to change, not up in the sky, but in our hearts." And he was right. Once silence is broken, nothing goes back to the way it was. In just minutes, as videos, comments, and hashtags explode across the internet, this small airplane cabin would become something no one expected. A symbol of dignity, a voice for the unheard, a mirror held up to society. Inside the first-class cabin of Sun Air Flight 227, the silence was so tense it felt like the air itself was vibrating. After the passengers spoke up in unison, everything seemed to pause. No one dared to add another word, not even Captain David Larson, a man used to being in control. Now, he could only stand still, facing the silent storm gathering in everyone's eyes. In seat 2A, Malcolm Reeves remained calm. He lowered his head, slowly removed his wristwatch, and placed it gently on the tray table. A small gesture, yet somehow, it made the atmosphere stretch even tighter, like a wire about to snap. Then suddenly, a phone rang. A deep, clear ringtone cut through the silence, like a crack in glass. All eyes immediately turned to Malcolm. He glanced at the screen. Jennifer Hart, VP Operations, Sun Air Holdings. Rachel recognized the name first. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Jennifer Hart, Vice President of Operations for Sun Air Holdings, the parent company that owned Sun Air Airlines, Malcolm answered, his voice steady as ever. "Jennifer, I'm here." Her voice came through the speaker tense. Clear, urgent. "Malcolm, I'm watching the live stream. The video is everywhere. What on earth is happening?" He exhaled softly, almost smiling. "Just a flight that became a little unusual. It seems some of our staff may need a refresher on passenger treatment." A silence fell on the line. Then Jennifer spoke again, more quietly, this time Malcolm. "Did they not know you were on that flight?" Malcolm looked around, saw Rachel frozen in place, saw Captain Larson frowning in confusion, and replied calmly, "No, and I didn't think they needed to. I wanted to see how they treated an ordinary passenger." Those words hit like lightning. Marcus, camera still recording, whispered into the phone's microphone. "Wait, is he?" Jennifer's voice returned. "More urgent now, Malcolm. We're suspending the entire crew pending investigation. I need you to step off the aircraft now. We'll handle this immediately." But Malcolm shook his head, voice steady no longer, just calm, but sharp and undeniable. "No need to rush. I'll leave this plane, but not because they ordered me to. I'll leave when I decide it's time." He set his phone down and turned to Captain Larson. "Seems like you're flying for me." "Captain." David blinked. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Malcolm stood, straightening his shirt collar. His voice was quiet, but carried through the entire cabin like a blade cutting air. "I am Malcolm Reeves, Chief Executive Officer of Sun Air Holdings, the company that owns Sun Air Airlines. And Jennifer Hart just informed me this flight is now under internal investigation." The cabin froze. Rachel's lips parted, but no words came out. Some passengers gasped softly. Marcus swung the camera toward Malcolm, capturing the shock spreading across the cabin. Whispers rose. "He's the CEO of the airline. He owns this place." David stepped back, his face drained of color. "Sir." "I had no idea," Malcolm cut him off, voice calm, but firm. "That's exactly the point. Captain, you didn't know, and you shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me decently. I don't ask for privilege. I ask for respect, the same respect every passenger deserves." A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Rachel lowered her head, her fingers clasped so tightly they turned white. She couldn't bring herself to look at the man she had doubted just because he didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. Marcus kept filming. Comments flooded the live stream. The CEO of the airline was profiled by his own staff. He kept calm the entire time. Unbelievable. This is going to change the aviation industry. Malcolm inhaled deeply, scanning the faces around him, no longer suspicious, but filled with a mix of respect and shame. His voice was low, steady. "Captain Larson, Ms. Porter, I don't need an apology. I want you to understand this: when people hold power, they sometimes forget they are serving real human beings with feelings, dignity, and history. Sooner or later, the truth will take seat 2A. No one spoke. Tears welled in Rachel's eyes, silently falling. Malcolm turned to Marcus and nodded. "Mr. Hill, thank you for recording this. Don't delete it. Let the world see that justice doesn't always wear a suit or carry a briefcase. Sometimes it's just someone who refuses to stand up." Marcus whispered hoarsely. "I won't delete it. Mr. Reeves." Captain Larson stood straighter, voice trembling. I accept responsibility. I'll report this to corporate immediately." Malcolm replied gently, but firmly. "No, Captain. You won't be flying this plane today. I've instructed Jennifer to ground this aircraft pending investigation. I'm not firing you, but I cannot allow someone who doesn't understand human dignity to take the controls. This plane will not leave the ground until the right thing is done." His words closed the moment like a door. Applause broke out first from a few passengers, then spreading through the entire cabin. They weren't clapping for his title or wealth. They were clapping for something far rarer: a man standing against injustice without losing his grace. Rachel stepped forward, tears on her cheeks. "Mr. Reeves, I'm so sorry. I'm ashamed." Malcolm placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ms. Porter, what matters isn't that we make mistakes. It's whether we choose to see them and change." He walked toward the exit. Behind him, silence returned, not of fear, but of awakening. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the runway. Inside, the cabin remained still, as if everyone had just witnessed something far bigger than a flight delay. Marcus held his phone steady, whispering into the stream. He didn't need to shout to prove his power. He just stood up, and the world went quiet to listen. The applause from the passengers gradually faded, leaving behind a strange silence. In the closed space of Sun Air Flight 227, Everyone felt that they had just witnessed something far beyond a simple aviation misunderstanding. It was like the moment a curtain falls, revealing the truth behind the roles everyone had believed were real. Malcolm Reeves still stood there, in front of seat 2A, the very place where minutes earlier he had been doubted, scrutinized, asked to leave. Now, that same spot had become the starting point for the collapse of a false layer of authority, a power built on prejudice instead of justice. Rachel Porter, the flight attendant who had once doubted him, hadn't yet recovered. The phone in her hand slipped to the floor with a sharp click. She bent down to pick it up, hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She had never imagined facing the CEO of the very airline she worked for, much less realizing that the man she had underestimated was the one she was serving. Captain David Larson stood frozen, his face drained of color, as if the blood had been pulled from his body. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Every belief he held that he was following procedure, that he had the authority to command, collapsed in an instant, because the person he had been commanding was the one with the power to decide the outcome of his actions. Malcolm looked around, eyes devoid of arrogance. He spoke, his voice low and clear. "This flight will not continue until this matter is resolved. I have contacted Vice President Jennifer Hart, and she is on her way to the airport." Rachel swallowed hard, voice trembling. "Sir, Mr. Reeves." Malcolm raised a hand, signaling her to stop. "Ms. Porter, I don't want to hear apologies. Not right now. I just want you and Captain Larson to understand every action has consequences." He picked up his phone, dialed a familiar number. Within seconds, everyone in the cabin heard Jennifer's voice over the speaker. "Malcolm, I've spoken to the operations team. Both the captain and lead flight attendant are suspended immediately pending investigation." Rachel let her hands drop. Captain Larson lowered his gaze, silent. A few passengers exchanged glances, but no one smirked. Instead, they remained quiet, a silence mixed with astonishment, empathy, and a heavy sense of witnessing justice unfold. Malcolm set down the phone and looked at David. "Captain Larson, I don't hate you. I just pity you. If you had observed calmly, you would have seen that I was neither threatening nor disruptive. You have power, but you chose to wield it to assert ego, not uphold fairness." David opened his mouth, searching for words. I was just following security procedures." Malcolm interrupted, gentle but firm. "Nos, Captain. Procedures do not require you to doubt someone because of how they look. Procedures do not teach you to judge people by skin color or shirt. What you followed was the habit of prejudice, and today it betrayed you." His words were neither loud nor sharp, yet they landed heavy, like a hammer. David stepped back, inhaled deeply, and silently nodded. Rachel burst into tears. She wiped her cheeks, voice choked. "Mr. Reeves, I know my apology can't undo what happened, but please believe me, I never intended to insult you." Malcolm nodded. "I believe you. But the scariest thing is not intentional hatred, it's unconscious bias. You didn't intend harm, but you still hurt me, and worse, you made others think it was normal." Rachel slumped into the nearest seat, hands covering her face, from seat 5D. Marcus continued filming, but his gaze had changed. He wasn't recording to expose anyone anymore. He was recording the human moment a man doubted yet composed, a captain once confident, now humbled, a flight attendant crying at the recognition of her mistake. He whispered into the camera, almost to himself, "You're witnessing the moment false power collapses, not with shouting, but with truth. Malcolm nodded subtly, acknowledging it. Then he spoke to the cabin. I don't want anyone here to feel this is revenge. I just want everyone to understand that true power doesn't come from issuing orders. It comes from choosing how to treat others when you think they have no power at all. An elderly woman, who had spoken up for Malcolm from the beginning, slowly stood. Mr. Reeves, today you didn't just teach them, you taught all of us. Because there were moments when I, too, stayed silent, too afraid to stand out. Malcolm smiled, his eyes warm a warmth only someone who has endured much could possess. Thank you, ma'am. Justice doesn't come from anger. It comes from awareness. Outside, the sun had set. The cabin lights switched on, illuminating the faces of each person. Expressions varied: regret, surprise, gratitude, or simple silence. David sat down, removed his pilot's hat, and placed it on the tray table. His voice hoarse. He said, Mr. Reeves, I don't know what I can do to make this right. Malcolm responded, start by listening. When people tell you they feel wronged, don't dismiss them as oversensitive. Ask yourself what you have overlooked. David lowered his head. For the first time in his career, he had nothing more to say. Marcus turned to the camera audience, voice deep and steady. There are powers that don't need to be taken away. They collapse on their own when faced with truth. Outside, the PA system announced Sun Air Flight 227 is temporarily delayed for an internal investigation. Rachel looked up, eyes red. She understood this flight could end her career, but it could also mark the beginning of a new person inside herself. Malcolm looked around one final time, then sat down gently. He buckled his seatbelt not to take flight, but as a way to close a chapter of life, one where he no longer needed to prove anything. The captain had lost control. The flight attendant had no excuse left. And the one who had been underestimated the most, the very man had made the entire cabin bow in respect. A flight that never took off, but landed people squarely with their own conscience. Sun Air Flight 227 still sat motionless on the Dallas runway, as if the plane itself were waiting to see what would happen next. After Malcolm Reeves revealed that he was the CEO of Sun Air Holdings, the silence inside the cabin rippled through every passenger like an electric shock. Captain David Larson sat silently near the cockpit door, his face pale, eyes vacant. He was used to having others obey his commands, but now, all he could do was bow his head before the man he had doubted just minutes ago. Rachel Porter stood a few steps away, eyes red, still unable to look up at Malcolm. The silence was so heavy you could hear someone's deep breath from the back of the cabin. Malcolm studied them for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. His voice rang out not loud, not angry, but impossible to ignore. Captain Larson, I'll be direct. You are not being fired, at least. Not yet. But you will not be flying this plane. Whispers erupted instantly. Some passengers nodded quietly. Some looked at Malcolm with admiration. David said nothing. That statement wasn't merely a command. It was a declaration of power, spoken not to punish, but to remind that true authority doesn't need to shout to be heard. Malcolm stepped forward into the cabin light, which illuminated his face calm, tired, but clear. He turned to the passengers, voice steady, as if speaking to each of them individually. Ladies and gentlemen, I know this is uncomfortable for all of you. I apologize for the delay of our flight and for having to witness something that should never have happened. But I also believe what we've seen today is not in vain, because if no one speaks up, incidents like this continue quietly, silently, and painfully. An older woman in seat 3B began to cry. She said nothing, simply nodded, as if to say, "We understand." Marcus Hill, live streaming the entire event, lowered his camera slightly, voice trembling with emotion. "You're hearing this. He's not just the CEO. He's a decent human being. He could have destroyed these people's careers, but instead, he chose to teach them with compassion." Outside, Marcus's video had surpassed 2 million views in just 15 minutes. Comments scrolled like a waterfall. "This is the calm the world needs." He could have yelled, but he chose humanity, a lesson in power, dignity, and truth. In the cabin, Malcolm turned to David silent, burdened with shame. His voice was slow. "Captain Larson, you once had the power to force me from this seat, but you wielded it incorrectly. Now I return the opportunity to you not to fly this plane, but to learn what it means to be a worthy commander." David swallowed hard, voice hoarse. "I understand. Mr. Reeves, I understand." Malcolm nodded, then turned to Rachel, who still held her hands tightly together. "Ms. Porter, I know you meant no harm, but ill intent isn't the only way to hurt someone. Sometimes, just doubting the wrong person is enough to leave a wound for a lifetime. You'll have to start over, but I believe you can." Rachel couldn't hold back her tears. She whispered, almost to herself, "Thank you for still believing we can change." Malcolm nodded slightly, then faced the passengers. He raised his hand, voice carrying a deep, resonant note, as if concluding a symphony that had passed through many emotional keys. "I don't want us to leave here with anger or satisfaction. I want us to leave with faith that the world can still be fair. That calm can be stronger than shouting, and that sometimes people don't need to prove their status to be treated like human beings." The cabin fell into complete silence. Then, as if by reflex, one person started clapping. The sound rang out alone, then spread, then surged louder, longer, echoing. Some passengers stood, some reached out to Malcolm, some cried. Marcus, still filming, exclaimed, "You're witnessing history." A flight delayed, but an entire society just soared higher. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, a faint smile crossing his face. He didn't need anyone's praise, didn't need to prove anything. In that moment, he felt relief. Perhaps his mother, the woman who had taught him, "You don't need to shout to be heard, just speak what's right," would smile with pride. Captain David removed his badge and placed it on the console. He approached Malcolm, extending his hand. "I don't deserve this, but thank you for not making me your enemy." Malcolm shook his hand without hesitation. "No one is an enemy. Captain, we're just people learning to be better." Rachel, still nearby, folded her hands in front of her chest, whispering, "Mr. Reeves, today, you didn't just save a flight. You saved our faith." He didn't answer, only smiled, and sat back in seat 2A. He glanced out the window where the sunset bathed the plain in golden light. The flight had not taken off, but human hearts had flown beyond a different limit, the line between arrogance and humility, between prejudice and justice. Marcus, streaming live, said his final words. "Sometimes, people don't need authority to change the world. They just need a moment when they choose wisdom over anger. And that, right there, is true power." The cabin continued to applaud. The sound echoed, like a triumphal chorus needing no soundtrack. Malcolm leaned back, eyes closed. He thought neither of fame nor position. He thought of only one thing today. He had not left his seat, and because of that, justice had found a place to sit. The sunset over the Dallas runway had faded, but the echo of that moment when Malcolm Reeves chose calm over anger continued to resonate. Sun Air Flight 297 never took off, but it changed far more than a single journey. It set in motion days when truth could no longer be hidden. And justice, even if delayed, still arrived. 6 weeks later, the name Malcolm Reeves was everywhere in the news. From local papers to national television, everyone was talking about the CEO who was doubted on his own flight. But what commanded respect was not his title. It was how he confronted insult with intelligence rather than anger. The story seemed closed after the first internal investigation. Yet just a week later, the official results from the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) were announced. Captain David Larson was charged with unlawful confinement of a passenger and abuse of authority in commercial airspace. The news hit like a lightning bolt through an already overcast sky. At a press conference, an FAA spokesperson declared no passenger, regardless of status or skin color, should ever be treated like a criminal because someone feels something is wrong. Authority in the cockpit can never supersede human dignity. David Larson was immediately terminated, and a federal court sentenced him to 18 months probation and 500 hours of community service for wrongful confinement and obstruction of passenger rights. The man who once boarded the plane with the pride of a captain now had to bow under the courtroom lights. As he read his confession, his voice trembled. "I didn't just lose my job. I lost the part of myself I thought I understood." And in the back row, a woman quietly bowed her head and cried. That was Rachel Porter. Following the investigation, Rachel's flight attendant certification was revoked for violating principles of fair treatment and failing to intervene when a passenger was mistreated. She did not protest. She knew the punishment was deserved. In a letter to Malcolm, she wrote, "I thought I was just following procedure, but in reality, I was hiding behind the word safety to justify my own fear. You taught me that sometimes courage isn't shouting, it's daring to speak the right thing when everyone else is silent." Malcolm did not reply. He simply sent a brief card with the words, "No one is born perfect. What matters is what we do after realizing we were wrong." Laura Bennett, a regional manager who had instructed the enhanced verification of passengers of color over the internal radio, could not escape scrutiny either. She was demoted to line supervisor, losing all managerial authority. In a brief interview, Laura admitted, "I didn't think what I did was discriminatory." But that phrase, "verify more carefully," said it all. None of them retained their previous positions. Yet it's notable that Malcolm Reeves never retaliated. He filed no lawsuits, demanded no dismissals, made no public attacks. All consequences came from the legal system, not from him. However, when the airline tried to settle quietly to avoid media attention, Malcolm refused. At a press conference, he said, "I don't want a private apology. I want a public reform, so no one else has to go through this." Sun Air Airlines then faced a civil rights lawsuit. The court ruled in Malcolm Reeves' favor, awarding $3.2 million for damage to reputation and emotional distress. On live television, Malcolm smiled and said, "I will not take a penny. All funds will be donated to the Wings of Dignity Foundation, supporting passengers who have faced discrimination or abuse in the air." The room erupted in applause. His voice was warm, calm, never boastful. No one deserves humiliation for how they look. If I can prevent even one person from experiencing that is the greatest reward I could ever have. In the following weeks, passenger Marcus Hill, who had live-streamed the entire event, became a sought-after media figure. His video surpassed 12 million views, and many news outlets called it a moment that made all of America look at itself. One online comment read, "Malcolm Reeves didn't just win in court, he won in people's hearts." And indeed, 6 weeks later, What began as a personal humiliation had become a collective lesson. The FAA mandated that all major U.S. airlines implement 40-hour training programs on recognizing and preventing unconscious bias for all flight crews. Hundreds of employees recounted shedding tears while rewatching Malcolm's video, not out of pity, but because they saw themselves in it. As for Sun Air Airlines, they installed new cabin cameras and created an independent oversight team to handle passenger complaints. At every airport, a small sign now hangs at the first-class gate, engraved with "Respect flies first." Malcolm no longer appeared before the media. He returned to work as usual, except that each morning when he entered his office, his desk displayed a printed frame from that video, him sitting in seat 2A, hands folded, face calm, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that composure can sometimes be the strongest weapon a person can wield. 6 weeks not long in a lifetime, but enough to change an airline and to make a society reflect on itself. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who watched the video, a belief was ignited. Justice is not the sound of a gavel in court. It is the awakening within a person's heart when they dare to face what is wrong. Time passed, but the story of Sun Air Flight 227 never faded. 6 weeks later, the media gradually stopped calling it a racial incident and began referring to it differently, the moment justice changed course in the skies. What began as a personal ordeal had become a catalyst for an entire system to reflect on itself. When the sentence for Captain David Larson was announced, Malcolm Reeves remained silent. He did not appear on TV, did not write op-eds, did not make any public statements. Yet in that silence lay weight. A man once doubted was now causing the aviation industry to ask itself, are we protecting safety, or are we protecting our own prejudices? The following week, Sun Air Airlines held a nationwide press conference. Jennifer Hart, Executive Vice President, the one who had called Malcolm during the flight, stood before the reporters, firm but with a trace of emotion. We cannot change the past, but we can ensure that what happened will never happen again. From that moment, Sun Air announced 3 historic policies later regarded as model reforms for the entire industry. First, the airline began installing high-resolution cabin cameras on all flights, not to monitor passengers, but to ensure every crew action was transparent. Whenever disputes arose, evidence would no longer rely on word or authority. Light does not lie, Malcolm had said when approving this plan. Second, all staff from flight attendants to captains were required to complete a 40-hour unconscious bias awareness training. They relearned to see people before skin color, to ask questions before judging, and to control reactions driven by fear. Rachel Porter, the flight attendant who had been suspended, was the first to re-enroll, even though she no longer worked at the airline. In a small interview, she said, "I cannot undo what I did, but I can learn why I acted that way. And maybe that is the beginning." Third, Sun Air created an independent passenger review board, a group including lawyers, social activists, and former airline employees. They were authorized to investigate any passenger complaint, independent of corporate management. Malcolm explained the decision in a brief Forbes interview. "I was once doubted. Right on the plane of my own company. I realized true justice shouldn't depend on someone's rank. It must exist beyond it." Within 3 months, the changes showed clear results. Passenger surveys reported a 37% increase in satisfaction, and complaints dropped by nearly half. Aviation experts called it the Reeves effect, the impact of a man who taught an entire system to act with dignity. Yet the most moving outcome wasn't the numbers, it was the human transformation. One afternoon, Malcolm walked past the internal training room and stopped at the window. Inside, Trainees were practicing verifying passengers with different appearances. Instructors switched roles. Those acting as passengers had to reenact the feelings of being doubted, while the attendants had to apologize and correct their actions. Malcolm stood there quietly for a long time. At one point, he smiled faintly, not out of pride, but because he knew real change always begins with people willing to listen. Outside, Marcus Hill, the passenger who live-streamed the flight, witnessed something similar. He was no longer filming in anger. He became a storyteller, appearing on TV programs, recounting that fateful day, not in a tone of condemnation, but with gentle narration. As a reminder, we don't need to add fuel to the fire. We just need to shine light where it's dark. His original video, an 8-minute live stream, surpassed 12 million views on Facebook and spread across platforms. One comment read, "We didn't see a black man humiliated. We saw a man teaching the world that composure is strength." Since then, the story of Sun Air Flight 227 has become an example in corporate ethics training, sociology classes, and even a short documentary adaptation. One newspaper remarked, "It is rare that a personal mistake can trigger systemic change, but that happens when the person involved chooses enlightenment over anger." In a late NPR interview, the host asked Malcolm, "Did you ever think that if you had lost your temper that day, the outcome would have been different?" Malcolm smiled faintly. He gazed into the distance, eyes calm. Now iconic, I think, if I had been angry. People would only remember the anger. But because I stayed calm, they remembered the reason for it. Short but profound. His answer captured the essence of the story. True power doesn't lie in who can command it. Lies in who can maintain dignity when insulted. From that day on, whenever a similar incident occurred on a train, in a restaurant, or at the office, people would remind each other, "Remember Sun Air 227. Remember Malcolm Reeves." And remarkably, no one referred to him as a CEO. They remembered him as a person who chose wisdom over ego. The story, once seemingly confined to one airline, sent ripples far beyond. 6 months later, Malcolm Reeves stepped onto the stage at the National Transportation Equity Conference, delivering a speech that silenced all of America, ushering in Part 13, the nation-shaking address. The changes within Sun Air Airlines didn't just calm the waves of public outrage, they sparked something else, hope. But as with any truly powerful story, Malcolm Reeves' journey did not end with reforming a system. 6 months later, his name appeared on the roster of keynote speakers for the National Conference on Transportation Equity in Washington, D.C., a gathering of leaders, civil rights attorneys, and aviation officials from across the United States. The conference hall was packed. Bright lights shone on the podium, where a lone microphone waited. Malcolm stepped forward, dressed in a simple gray suit, no tie. He could have been any man in the room, if not for the fact that he had made an entire industry pause and reflect on itself. As the applause faded, he began. His voice was not loud, but it carried weight not through volume, but through the substance of every word. 6 months ago, I was just another passenger. I bought my ticket. I sat in my seat, and I was asked to leave, not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone thought I might be wrong. I spent 20 minutes in which every ounce of my dignity, education, and achievement was compressed into a single suspicious glance, and what hurt the most was that I wasn't surprised. The room fell completely silent. No one dared move. For a moment, everyone seemed forced to confront the silence within themselves, the part of them too accustomed to accepting that's just how it is. Malcolm inhaled, then continued, his tone softening. as though telling a story rather than giving a speech. I am not here to recount an incident. I am here to talk about us, about how silence has become complicity, and how fear has guided us more than conscience ever should. He paused, scanning the room, hundreds of people of all races and professions listening intently. You know, he said, in this country, we've been flying for over a century. Yet today, people are still forced to land just because they don't look like someone who belongs in first class. The words cut like a needle through the pretense of calm. A few eyes glistened with tears, some nodded, others lowered their heads to take notes. Malcolm continued, I have heard people say, we need time to change. But I ask time for whom we've waited hundreds of years to sit at the same table, to sit in the same cabin, to see each other as human beings. We don't need more time. We need more courage. He stepped back, hands resting lightly on the wooden podium, his expression calm, but his eyes shone with the light of someone who had endured much, forgiven more than the world expected. Dignity isn't a privilege, he said slowly, each word carving the air. It's a right. Applause erupted, then quieted as he gestured for the audience to sit, continuing in a lower, almost whispered tone, but every ear caught it. I know there are people in this room who have chosen silence when faced with injustice, maybe out of fear of losing a job, fear of isolation, or simply thinking, it doesn't concern me. But do not forget when injustice happens to someone, and we remain silent, tomorrow that injustice may come for us. Malcolm did not employ rhetoric. He spoke with authentic emotion. He spoke of his mother, who taught him to stand with kindness, his father, who once silently endured being barred from a bus just because of his skin, and himself, who chose to remain in seat 2A rather than leave in anger. I stayed, not to prove strength. I stayed because if I left, they would have thought they were right. And I could not allow that, not just for me, but for those who come after. As he spoke, the large screen behind him displayed Marcus Hill's video, the clip that had gone viral worldwide. Malcolm sitting calmly, hands folded, under the suspicious gaze of the crew. No soundtrack, no effects, just a man holding his dignity in a moment of insult. Malcolm looked up at the screen, then back at the crowd. I don't want to be remembered as a CEO. I want to be remembered as a passenger, someone who didn't leave their seat, because they knew if he left, justice would leave with him. Down below. Marcus, the man who live-streamed the flight, sat in the fourth row, bowing his head, wiping away a tear. He never imagined his video would go so far, let alone become part of a national lesson. As the speech neared its conclusion, Malcolm stepped down from the podium, not reading from notes, needing no script. He spoke with his own breath. I don't want you to be angry because of me. I want you to not remain silent for yourself. If we do not act when someone is humiliated, if we do not question when we see wrong, then we are complicit in keeping the system that allows it to happen. I do not ask anyone to fight. I only hope that, when someone is pushed out of their seat in a plane, at work, or in life, you will be the one to help them sit back down. His voice caught on the last words. Then something extraordinary happened. The audience did not immediately applaud. They stood in silence, as if his words were still echoing in their minds. A minute later, the entire room erupted clapping, long and strong, full of emotion. Some cried, some placed their hands over their hearts, and on Malcolm's face, there was no victorious smile, only profound peace. As he left the stage, a journalist from The Atlantic ran up and asked Mr. Reeves, Do you think this speech will change America? Malcolm smiled faintly. No, I don't believe a speech can change America. But I do believe that if every person remembers what it felt like to be underestimated, they will know what must change. That speech spread like a slow-burning fire. Within weeks, from small conversations in cafes to online campaigns demanding justice, a new movement was born, Skies for All. And that marked the beginning of Part 14. The movement expands. When Malcolm Reeves' speech ended, its echo did not fade like so many others. It wasn't just applause or flashy headlines. It became a quiet wave, spreading from conference halls to coffee shops, from smartphone screens to boardrooms of transportation companies across America. People began talking about the 2A effect named after Malcolm's seat on that fateful Sun Air 227 flight. But Malcolm did not want to be associated with any effect. In a small local interview, he said, "I don't want this story to stop with me. If justice only reaches one person, it's never real justice." A few weeks after his speech in Washington, Malcolm announced the founding of the Skies for All Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at supporting passengers who have experienced discrimination in public spaces, especially in aviation, transportation, and service industries. The foundation's headquarters was located in Atlanta, inside a renovated old pilot training building. On the wall hung a small, simple sign. "We cannot change the sky, but we can change how we see one another under it." At the launch event, Malcolm didn't invite the press. Instead, he invited people who had been moved from their seat in life. An Indian woman once denied boarding for wearing a sari. A Latinx veteran called suspicious by security. A black teenager kicked off a bus for a suspected ticket issue. They were all there, quietly. And when Malcolm stepped forward, he didn't speak long. He simply began. "We've all been underestimated somewhere, but today we sit together and no one has to leave their seat." That moment marked the birth of the Skies for All movement. Within 3 months, dozens of airlines, bus companies, and rail services nationwide partnered with the foundation. They sponsored anti-bias training, organized multicultural customer service workshops, and provided legal support for those who had experienced mistreatment in public services. The media called Malcolm the man restoring trust among the clouds, but he refused any title. "I just stayed in my seat," he said, "and I thought it was time to help others stay in theirs." The most surprising part, the movement's slogan, the very words he had uttered on the plane that day. When told to leave, "I'm not going anywhere." At first, it was a personal declaration. Soon, it was shared millions of times on social media, printed on shirts, coffee mugs, and billboards. For many, it became a quiet proclamation of self-respect. A woman in Ohio tweeted, "When they said I wasn't qualified for the job because of my age, I thought of Malcolm Reeves. I said to myself, I'm not going anywhere." An Asian American student shared, "When I was told, don't speak your native language in public, I thought of him, and I smiled, and I spoke anyway. I'm not going anywhere." That phrase no longer belonged to Malcolm alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, pushed aside, but chose to stay, to believe, to be proud. News networks covered it. Schools invited Malcolm to speak. Major airports began displaying small electronic signs. "Fly fair, fly free, Skies for All." Even direct competitors of Sun Air sent letters expressing their wish to collaborate, saying they wanted to be part of the change, not left outside it. When asked about it, Malcolm simply replied, "I don't believe in victory. I believe in awakening." The movement grew, yet Malcolm maintained his old habits, riding the bus to work, making his own coffee, occasionally buying economy tickets for short business trips. He joked with his assistant, "After all, I still prefer a window seat to seat 2A. Once, while waiting for a flight in Atlanta, a young woman approached, hands trembling with a book showing his photo on the cover. She said, 'You don't know. When you stayed in your seat that day, you made me want to stay with my own dreams.' Malcolm just smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. If even one person felt stronger after that day, then everything I endured was worth it." Malcolm Reeves and the Skies for All movement were no longer just news stories. They became part of American popular culture. TV shows, podcasts, even films drew inspiration from it. But more importantly, it achieved something no speech could. It made people want to be better human beings. On social media, those who had experienced discrimination began sharing their own stories, using the hashtag #I'm not going anywhere, not to incite outrage, but to spread resolve. An African-American taxi driver wrote back then, "They called me the black guy who drives. Today, they call me Mr. Malik, the man who helps them get home safely, and I'm not going anywhere." A Native American nurse shared, "I was once refused care because patients thought I wasn't clean. I cried. But the next day, I still went to the hospital. I'm not going anywhere." And so, the movement grew quietly, without political slogans, without violence. It was built by ordinary people choosing to stay with their dignity. Malcolm Reeves was no longer just the symbol of one event. He became a symbol of human perseverance, someone who doesn't retaliate, yet never steps back. When asked what brought him the most happiness, he simply said, "It's when I walk through an airport and see a black person, an immigrant, or an elderly passenger smiling in seat 2A and no one asks if they belong there." But Malcolm's story didn't end there. After all the recognition, the movement, and the ripple effects, he chose to return to where it all began, seat 2A on an ordinary flight. And there, he would share the final message the world needed to hear. The evening sky was painted in soft gold as Malcolm Reeves sat back in seat 2A on another flight this time. Not as a CEO, not as the man who had shaken an entire airline industry, but simply as an ordinary passenger. With a small notebook and a cooling cup of coffee, the flight from Atlanta to Seattle carried no cameras pointed at him, no whispers of recognition. Everything was ordinary, as if Sun Air 227 had never happened. Yet in that ordinary moment, Malcolm felt the most profound truth of his life, that sometimes justice doesn't arrive with shouting, but in the quiet pauses. The plane climbed steadily, and he leaned his head toward the window. Below, thick clouds stacked in layers, reminiscent of the prejudices humans have yet to unravel. Yet above them, the sky remained blue-free, eternal. He smiled softly. Perhaps he finally understood true freedom is not flying higher than others, but not letting bitterness pull you down. Since the Skies for All movement spread, thousands who had endured injustice had written to Malcolm. They shared their stories, those underestimated because of skin color, age, status, or voice. Each letter was a tiny piece of America not perfect, but learning to heal itself. He read each letter slowly, noting thoughts in his journal, pausing on certain lines. "I'm not afraid anymore. I sit, and now people have to listen to me. Thank you, sir, for teaching us that justice isn't something we demand, it's something we become." Malcolm had once doubted his ability to create lasting change. He only believed that, in a world rushing forward, one person daring to sit still could make the whole world pause and reflect. When a flight attendant brought another cup of coffee, she smiled and said softly, Mr. Reeves, I know your story. I study aviation, and the first lesson my teacher taught is never judge anyone sitting in seat 2A. Malcolm chuckled, a warm, relieved smile. He didn't need titles, plaques, or recognition. Just one person remembering, one person learning kindness, that was enough. He turned to the window again, watching the sunset fade, thinking of his mother, who once told him you can't force anyone to respect you, but you can make it impossible for them to ignore your dignity. Those words now echoed like a farewell across the sky. Malcolm's story was never just about a flight. It was about everyone who had been underestimated in the 2A seat of their own life. Those told to leave, simply because someone else thought they didn't belong. Those mocked for dreaming too big, judged for standing tall in the crowd without bowing down. Seat 2A at its deepest meaning isn't just a seat. It's a symbol of human dignity, a place of trial, where we must choose leave silently or stay with self-respect. Malcolm chose to stay, and because of that, countless others chose to stay with him. From airports to offices, classrooms to hospitals, people began telling the story of the man in seat 2A. No longer just news. It became a moral lesson, simple, enduring, unforgettable. A teacher in Texas wrote on the blackboard, "Dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right." A 10-year-old child asked their mother, "Mom, if someone pushes me out of seat 2A, can I sit back down?" And the mother replied, "If you sit back because you know you're right, you always have the right to be there." When the plane finally touched down in Seattle, Malcolm stayed seated for a few more moments. Passengers stood, grabbed luggage, and hurried off. But he lingered. There was something sacred in this pause, as if every quiet breath was a thank you for the years he had braved storms standing his ground. The flight attendant approached, smiling, "Mr. Reeves, the plane has come to a complete stop." He nodded, returning a gentle look. "Yes, I know, but sometimes we need to stay a little longer to remember why we didn't leave." He stood, donned his jacket, and glanced at seat 2A one final time. There was something sacred in that seat, not because it was first class, but because it had been the battlefield of dignity, where a human chose intellect over pride. As he stepped off the plane, sunlight fell across his face. A young passenger waiting for the next flight quietly said, "Mr. Reeves, I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I learned to stay in my seat." Malcolm smiled, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder, and walked on. No words were needed. The story was no longer his. It had become the story of everyone ever underestimated, forced to step back and chose instead to stand tall. Outside the terminal, he paused by a large billboard spanning the concourse. In blue letters, it read, "Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It arrives when someone refuses to move." He stared at it for a long moment, then nodded. Perhaps this was the simplest way to encapsulate a life that had learned that true power lies not in winning over others, but in keeping one's humanity amidst the storm. Malcolm Reeves' story closed here not with applause or flashing cameras, but with a meaningful silence, the kind only those understand who know justice doesn't arrive on its own. It arrives when we refuse to move. And somewhere out there, in today's blue sky, other people sat in the 2A seats of their own lives, choosing to stay, to believe, to live honorably, knowing this sky is wide enough for all. The story of Malcolm Reeves, the black man questioned simply for sitting in a first-class seat, is not just about racial prejudice. It's about dignity, something no one can take away unless we surrender it ourselves. In a moment of humiliation, Malcolm did not get angry, did not walk away. He chose to stay, with intelligence and calm, proving that true strength lies not in power, but in how we respond when we are underestimated. We live in a world where everyone has been judged by appearance, age, or status. Yet this story reminds us that justice doesn't arrive on its own. It arrives when we refuse to move. By holding on to our self-respect, we not only protect ourselves, but also create space for others to be treated fairly. If one person like Malcolm can change an entire system simply by sitting still, then each of us in our work, in our families, in daily life, can also impact the world around us through calmness, courage, and compassion. His example shows that sometimes the quietest acts make the loudest statement. Remaining seated, standing firm, speaking truth gently, these are the ways ordinary people can spark extraordinary change. It's a reminder that integrity and empathy often carry more power than authority or aggression. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If Malcolm Reeve's story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to help us continue spreading stories of humanity, fairness, and the strength within us all. Because sometimes, one small act is enough to change the sky.